Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking with Terra Freeman from the Extension Office, and today she's going to be talking about compost. So I'm Amy Ackerman, the Assistant Branch Manager of the Main Library in St. Augustine, Florida, and this is Terra. Hey, Terra, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Good morning, Amy. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm excited to talk to you all today about compost. It's one of my favorite topics because whatever you are growing in your vegetable or herb garden, healthy soils are going to get you off to the right start and help you to be more successful. So we'll focus on how to get off to a good start in this new year.
So why is it important now in February to be thinking about compost?
Well, a lot of people are already starting their vegetable gardens. So anything you plant, vegetables, herbs, strawberries, healthy soils are truly the starting place to having a successful garden. And Florida soils in general are naturally very low in organic matter. On average, they just have 1.5%. So organic matter, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term, it's basically just plant and animal tissue that's in various stages of decomposition. So if you think about the forest floor, there are leaves breaking down, acorns, seeds, insect remains, etc. They're all in various stages of decomposition. So in the forest, compost happens naturally, but we can recreate that in our gardens, in our compost bin, in our compost area, in order to create compost, which will add organic matter to our gardens, which is going to solve all sorts of soil issues and it just improve the soils across the board.
So can you tell us a little bit more about exactly how compost works? Like what's the theory behind it, or how does it work?
Okay, sure. So the reason compost is so important is because it's going to improve the soil's quality as well as structure. And this includes things like fertility. So it's going to add a certain amount of nutrients to the soil. It's not going to provide all of the nutrients you need for your vegetable garden because vegetables are pretty heavy feeders, but it's going to provide some. So you will still need to supplement with another choice of fertilizer, organic or non, whatever you choose to use. Compost is going to improve the soil's water holding capacity. Especially in Florida, we have these sandy soils. So it just drains right through, things leach right through. So when you have this compost and it's improving the soil texture, that the particles are changing and it's also improving the ability to hold the moisture in the soil. It also improves aeration. So that helps the roots to breathe properly. It improves the buffering capacity of the soil as well. And that's just the soil's resistance to sudden changes in pH. Because as we've talked about before, if the pH is off, then the plants will not be able to use the nutrients that are in the soil. So it's going to help, just kind of balance out the pH situation. And it can also suppress nematodes because the more healthy microorganisms you have in the soil, it's going to help combat the unhealthy organisms in there. So in Florida, whether your soil is sand, silt, or clay, you cannot go wrong by adding compost. It's going to impart all sorts of benefits. It's going to make your garden healthier and more successful.
So when we're at our home or apartment or condo and we're looking around, where is the best location to start a compost pile? Or what can we do if we don't have room for a compost pile?
Oh, okay. So I would say out of sight of your neighbors is a very good starting place. So probably going to put it in your backyard, someplace accessible. So if you have a vegetable garden, you want it close enough that you will easily walk over to it and throw your, weeds or, garden scraps that you're not using in there. Or, even if you don't have a vegetable garden, whatever kind of garden you have, just have it so that it's accessible. And as far as sun or shade, I would say maybe half sun, half shade. I wouldn't put it in deep shade because it would likely get too wet because of all the rains that we get in the summertime. Part of compost is having the right moisture balance. So having it somewhere near a water source, even if it's just a garden hose, is going to also be beneficial.
And what sort of device or receptacle? I have a friend, she's got this really fancy thing that has like a crank and she cranks it every once in a while. What do we need to actually put the compost in?
Okay, so that's a good question. And the simplest answer is it really doesn't matter so much what receptacle you are using, so long as it's the proper dimensions. So 1 cubic yard is the minimum size you want to have. So that's 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, 3 foot wide, 3 foot tall, 3 foot deep. So, and if you have it at that 1 cubic yard size, it will have the ability to get hot enough to create compost. And you can certainly have it bigger as well. So as far as bins go, you talk about the kind that you crank and turn. Those are great because they make it easier to mix, because mixing your ingredients is one aspect of creating compost. So, and it also keeps it off the ground and it keeps critters out of it. So it does have all sorts of benefits. And they have holes in it to allow for aeration. For that, you have to go out of your way to add more water with your garden hose, but that's not a big deal. There are bins that just sit on the ground, and there are bins that you can build out of wood. They have 3 compartments. So you have your starter here, and then when you turn it, you put it into the middle one, and then when it's done, you put it in the third one, and then you start over. There's a lot of different methods and ways of going about it, but the main thing is just that it can have that 3 by 3 by 3 element to it, so that it does have the capacity to heat up enough.
Okay. So we found a location and a receptacle that we want to use. How do we actually get started with compost? Is it just about throwing our salad into a pile, or do we need to be getting some other things in there?
Okay, so I really want to stress that you can't mess it up. So there are different methods of making compost. So we have the slow or cold composting method, which is the easiest, but it's also going to take the longest before you get compost. So for that, simplest method, you can just throw your organic matter into a pile and let it sit as long as it needs in order to decompose. And this could take anywhere from a few months to a year. And we'll talk in a little bit about the different materials that go into it. But, we're talking like weeds, garden scraps, kitchen scraps. We'll go into the details of what you should and shouldn't put in there. But the slow or cold composting method, if you don't have a lot of time and maybe your main goal isn't to produce compost really quickly, and maybe you just want to keep your lawn debris and your food scraps out of the landfill, well, then that is a great way to do it. Just throw them in a pile somewhere, and you will want to have a certain mixture of greens and browns, which we'll talk about. But yes, you can do that and not worry about it so much. But when most people, they want to produce compost a little more quickly than that, and that we call hot composting or the fast composting mix. And I imagine that's probably what we'll focus on most in today's conversation, because that requires a little bit more knowledge. And then I think you asked, what do people do that don't have a big yard or a big garden, but they still need compost? Well, there is a method called vermicomposting, which is just composting with worms in a bin. And that's great if you don't have a large yard, or if you live in a condo and maybe you want compost just to fertilize your house plants, or maybe you just want to keep your food scraps out of the landfill. So we can talk about that as well.
So you mentioned greens and browns. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So when building a compost bin, it requires 2 different types of materials. So greens are the nitrogen source, browns are the carbon source, and you need to have a balanced amount of both. So the greens, the nitrogen source, these have the high moisture content. They break down pretty quickly, and they provide the microorganisms. The microorganisms are responsible for breaking down the organic matter, but the greens provide the microorganisms the raw building blocks for protein that's necessary for them to grow and reproduce. So examples of greens, grass clippings, plant trimmings, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, seaweed. And then we have the browns, which are the carbon sources. These break down, decompose more slowly, and they serve as an energy source for the microorganisms, which are the critters doing the job, breaking down this compost or breaking down the organic matter into compost. So examples of the browns or carbon sources: leaves, pine needles, peanut shells, paper towels, paper towel holders, shredded newspaper, wood chips. So ideally, you want an ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio with these greens and browns. The ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio is 30:1. I don't want people to get stuck on, oh my gosh, I have to measure these ingredients, because you don't need to. Basically, if you have a 2:1 ratio of greens to browns, so you have 2 parts greens to 1 part brown, and some people do 1:1 ratio. If you have it in that general range, it's going to work. And when you are adding these materials to your compost bin, you can either just mix them all together at first, or if you want to be a little more methodical about it, you can layer, a 3 to 4 inch layer of greens, and then a 3 to 4 inch layer of browns, and they call it the sandwich method. And you're just packing those on top of each other, and then you're gonna mix it all up, stir it all together. But one important thing to keep in mind is your very top layer. Try to always have the carbon or the brown sources on top. So when you're done, add some more brown carbon sources, and that's because they seal in any potential odors.
Oh, yeah. So I guess the important thing to remember is that as this is an ongoing project, it's not just about throwing the table scraps or the yard clippings in there. We have to remember to add some brown stuff in there as we go along also.
Correct. And in addition to that, a few other elements to keep in mind. So the compost does need to have a certain moisture level. So we don't want it soggy, but we don't want it super dry. So ideally, you want it to be the texture of, say, a wrung out sponge.
Okay.
And then other things to keep in mind are aeration. So aeration is going to help the microbes work more efficiently, and it's also going to reduce unpleasant odors. So if your compost pile starts to smell off or bad, 2 things you can do: turn your pile, add more of the brown carbon sources. That's going to solve the issue. Temperature is important as well. So the ideal temperature range for your compost where it's going to break down, the most efficiently, is between 122 and 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So they do sell compost thermometers that people can buy if they like to track the temperature of their compost pile. And I've been creating compost for like 20 something years, and I've never used a compost thermometer, and it works just fine. But other people want to track it and be more efficient with it. And so they certainly sell compost thermometers that you can use.
Okay. So, and you mentioned aeration. How often should we be aerating our compost?
Okay. So you can turn the pile about once a week.
Mm-hmm.
So, depending on the method you have, if you have one of those kinds that turn, that makes it real easy. But if it's on the ground, you just use a pitchfork, mm-hmm. and you turn it, you mix it up, or you can flip the whole thing over into a pile next to where it is.
Okay.
Whatever works for your system.
And about how long on average does it take to create some really good compost, or how do we even know when it's ready?
Okay, so it really depends on a variety of factors and how diligent we are at turning and adding the right balance of materials. That being said, it could take a few months up to a year. And you know it's ready because finished compost will have a rich, brown, nice crumbly texture, and it will not have a bad odor. It has a pleasant, earthy smell to it. So when you think it's done, you actually want to let it sit for a while and let it cure until it's completely done. And then at that point, you can start working on a fresh compost pile, start a new batch. And what you do when the compost is done, you can sift it. So I've always made out of a wooden frame and hardware cloth, a sifter, where you shovel your compost on top of it, you sift it through and into a wheelbarrow or wherever, and then you're left with your nice compost, and what's left on top of the hardware cloth or screen or whatever you're using are the larger chunks, the larger particles, and those, because they've not finished decomposing or breaking down into compost, you can put those into your new compost pile to let them finish up. Or if you have compost that's not quite done, it still has some larger chunks, you could use that as mulch. But if you want finished compost for that, you will put about like a 2 to 4 inch layer on your soil, top dress it, and then you can mix it in 4 to 6 inches, till it in. You can use it in potting soil. So top dress or mix in, unless it hasn't broken down enough and for some reason you want to use it, in which case kind of use it just like mulch. Because if you mix in the particles that are not broken down enough and there are too many large particles, it's going to tie up nutrients in your soil, because the microorganisms are going to keep working on breaking that down rather than other things that the plants could use.
So speaking of what plants are able to use, are there things that we should not be putting into a compost pile?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that. There are a few key things that we want to keep out of our compost pile. That would include meat, bones, fatty food waste, dairy products. Any of these could attract pests, and they can smell bad. You definitely want to keep out any invasive exotic plants, because they may not break down the seeds well enough, and then you could inadvertently spread them. Obviously, you'd want to keep out human or pet waste, possibility of disease, chemically treated products, so that could affect the plants that you want to grow, that you will be using the compost on later. So that includes pesticides, like if pesticides have been, or herbicides, or on these plants, whatever you put in there has the potential to show up in the plants that you apply the compost to later. So that includes diseased plants. So, if your vegetable plants or any plants had some sort of leaf spot or disease or nematodes, in that case, you just want to put that in the trash, not in your compost bin, because that has the potential to not heat up significantly high enough to break down those problems, and they could transfer to your new garden.
So you had mentioned earlier the worms. Can you talk a little bit more about how to get a vermiculture receptacle ready and what's involved with that?
Oh, sure. So I'm glad you asked. Worm bins, that's one of my favorite projects. I've had a worm bin on and off for the past 20-something years. They are lots of fun. We actually use them in the Master Gardener program to teach kids about composting with worms, but adults have just as much fun with it. So the basic rundown on creating a worm bin is you get a plastic tub that you can buy at a big box store somewhere. And it's kind of shallow, just 8 to 12 inches deep. They tend to be gray or blue. Doesn't have to be, I'm just saying when you find them. You want 2 of these bins. Okay, so you're gonna put one inside the other. The top bin, you're going to drill holes with the drill into the lid, and then you're gonna drill holes in the bottom of the top bin. So the holes in the top lid are for aeration. The holes in the bottom are for drainage. And then you're going to put that second bin underneath of it, so that the top bin is sitting in it, and it's going to capture any liquids, which we call compost tea, which are highly, provide nutrients in a liquid form for plants. So for that, some people like to elevate the bin, separate the bins slightly from each other so there's more room for the liquid to build. And for that, you can use an upside down flower pot. Some people use a brick, just something in there to give a little bit of, just a little bit of space between the two, so that otherwise they'll just be, like not enough space, and the liquid that filters through could end up sitting in the actual worm bin area.
And so what's different from a worm bin than a compost pile, other than the worms, of course?
Okay, so they're very similar. A few differences. So when you're building the worm bin, okay, so you have your bin built like we talked about it. You're going to put in some bedding for the worms. So that could be shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard, and that's also a carbon source. You're going to put in a handful of worms, and the worms you use are typically red wigglers. So they are a type of earthworm, but they are different than the earthworm we find when we dig in the ground. Red wigglers naturally live in the leaf litter layer. So when you're creating bedding for them with the shredded paper, you are recreating like the leaf litter layer that they would naturally be found in. So you want to find red wigglers. Sometimes you have to order them. You can ask around at local stores, but if they don't have them, sometimes you have to order them. And then, okay, so you have your bin, you have your shredded bedding, you have your worms. A little bit of starter compost, which you just dig it out of your garden, something to get it started, and then their food source. So their food source, it's pretty much the same, except, well, it's smaller area. So people usually just use food scraps from their kitchen, and it's the same rules about no meat, dairy, or anything that's going to smell like that. Usually, salad greens or leftover vegetable, like apple cores, that type of thing. You wouldn't believe how much of the stuff that you have that can go in there every day if you want. And then, so that's how you start. You give it a little bit of spray with some water, because so worms breathe through their skin. So as the bin matures, it's going to develop a lot of moisture in there. But in the very beginning, you're going to need to start off with some moisture, because you imagine that shredded paper, it's super dry. Worms breathe through their skin. So you need to make that a little moist for them to start off with. But eventually they are going to eat the food you give them. And if you don't have enough kitchen scraps, go out and pull some weeds, right? And try to keep the seeds out. I do that all the time. And they will eat this stuff, and it will turn into what we call worm castings, which is a fancy way of saying worm poop. And the worm castings are high in nutrients, and they're a nice, crumbly, dark, rich brown color, really nice soil texture. So you can use it just as you would other compost, because it doesn't make as large of quantities. You oftentimes can use it to top dress your houseplants, or use the compost tea that leaches out the bottom that's captured into that bottom bin. You can use that to fertilize your garden or your houseplants. And it does create compost tea pretty quickly. The worms reproduce very rapidly. So it's nice if you have a friend that wants, ask around, because you want people to share your worms with. Otherwise, sometimes they reproduce pretty quickly. So you can always put them in your garden if you get too many.
So when that one is ready and you have this big box of compost and worms, do you just dump the whole thing in the garden, or do you need to do something to get the worms out?
Good question. Okay, so it's lots of fun harvesting the compost from your worm bin. What I usually do is dump the contents of the bin onto a tarp, and in the sunlight, because worms are going to retreat from the light, right? They're not going to like it. So they are going to retreat towards all the soil, the compost that's on the inside, and you're just going to keep like brushing off that top layer of compost worm castings they've created. And then, in the center, there will be like compost with worms, and just put those back in your bin, start over, give them some fresh bedding, some fresh food scraps, and your bin's starting over again. And then you can just use all the compost that was on top, and you've tried to get out as many worms as you can, but just to put back in your bin. But it's okay if they end up in your garden as well. So then you just go use it like you would normal compost.
So I think that's pretty much all the questions that I had. Was there anything else that we need to know about composting?
I would just say, just to reiterate, that regardless of what type of soil you're starting with, sand, clay, loam, it's going to improve the soil's structure and soil quality and impart all sorts of benefits. Because, you can imagine in Florida with these sandy soils, everything just leaches through, and you want to create soils where the nutrients and the moisture, the irrigation stays for longer, so it doesn't run off into the aquifer. So adding this compost, improving the soil, it's going to keep all of these things you put into your soil there longer. So the more you add over time, the better. But that being said, it has to be mixed into the native soils. You can't just use pure compost. That's going to be too rich and it can burn your plants.
Oh, okay. I wouldn't have even thought of that. So that's a good cautionary message to pass along.
I've learned that from experience.
So if people have further questions or want to do some further reading on the topic, do you have any recommended websites or anything like that?
Sure. I'll give you some links that if you want to share. There's a publication called Compost Tips for the Home Gardener that we refer to a lot. And there's another series of Florida-friendly landscaping publications that are due out soon. And if they're out at the time of publishing this, I'll be sure to send you one because we have a new one on nutrient cycling and composting in your vegetable garden.
Very good. And if people have any further questions beyond that, is there like a phone number or can they just call you up at the extension office?
Absolutely. They can call me at the extension office or send me an email. Email is terraf@ufl.edu.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Oh, and I did want to mention also that for folks who are coming to the library, we do definitely have some composting books at the library, so people can always check some of those out as well. Otherwise, I don't really have any other questions. So thank you very much, Terra, for joining us today. And this is really good information on how to get started in composting. So I appreciate you joining us.
You are very welcome. It was my pleasure. Take care.
Mm-hmm.